After almost 4 years of fighting, Japan finally announced their government surrender on August 15, 1945, in Japan's time zone, which was August 14th in the United States. On August 30th, General MacArthur arrived in Japan to oversee the formal surrender ceremony and to organize the post-war Japanese government. On September 2nd, the Japanese signed the armistice agreement aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, formally ending World War II. Japan was a devastated nation. Its infrastructure and economy were all but destroyed, diseases were rampant, and hunger engulfed its people. General MacArthur arrived without pomp, ceremony, or victory parade. After his plane landed in a nearby airport, he simply proceeded by car to the U.S. headquarters in nearby Yokohama. Along the way, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers lined the road, their bayonets fixed on him. It was their last act of defiance, for there was real terror in their hearts, as most expected the worst. However, over the next 6 years, General MacArthur unexpectedly brought peace, justice, and democracy to the Japanese people. Faced with this dire situation upon his arrival, General MacArthur exerted pressure on the U.S. government to immediately assist Japan with 3.5 million tons of food and $2 billion worth of emergency aid. MacArthur not only kept the current Japanese government, but he also withstood pressure from some in the United States by forgiving Emperor Hirohito. He also responded to the millions of demobilized Japanese soldiers arriving back home by giving them the means to be quickly reintegrated into civilian society. This is covered more in detail in the EmersusTech video, Was Emperor Hirohito Blameless? After responding to the immediate needs of the Japanese people, MacArthur next ordered the release of thousands of political prisoners, including members of the Communist Party. He also lifted government-imposed censorship, allowing for freedom of the press and expression for the first time in the nation's history. On October 4th, during a meeting with MacArthur, a high-ranking Japanese cabinet member had asked whether the Supreme Commander had any instructions about the makeup of the Japanese government. However, the translator had mistakenly used the word constitution instead of makeup, giving the official the mistaken impression that MacArthur had commissioned him to draft a new constitution. When the Japanese presented their efforts in early 1946, MacArthur rejected them as nothing more than a rewording of the old constitution. MacArthur then took matters into his own hands, ordering his government section to draft a document themselves. On February 3rd, MacArthur established 3 principles for the draft plan of constitution for Japan: the emperor as symbol of state and of the unity of the people, the renunciation of war, the sovereignty residing in the people. He gave these principles to General Courtney Whitney, the chief of the General Headquarters Government Section. The next day, Whitney called 25 staff into a small meeting room and tasked them with an enormous challenge. They were to draft a new Japanese constitution within a week, which had to include the 3 principles set out by MacArthur. It was to be of the highest priority and confidential. This stunned them all, but they suddenly jumped on the challenge. Among the drafting members, 4 were experienced lawyers, but none of them had specialized in constitutional law. The American staff raced around the still decimated Tokyo in a jeep, collecting all the foreign constitutions that could be found. They found private Japanese constitution drafts such as the one written by the Constitution Research Association, and used them as models for the new draft document. The American staff had to draft a suitable document quickly, or else MacArthur would have put the issue directly to the Japanese people. After much work, the new constitution acknowledged the emperor as head of state. However, he was stripped of any real power. A legislature with a weak upper chamber was established, and all noble rights were removed, with the exception of the imperial family. There were 39 articles that dealt with what MacArthur called basic human liberties. Not only did they include most of the American Bill of Rights, but also universal adult suffrage, labor's right to organize, and a host of marriage and property rights for women. Notably absent was the citizen's right of gun ownership as detailed in the Bill of Rights. But the most unique and one of the most important provisions came in Article 9, which outlawed the creation of armed forces, renounces war and possession of potentially belligerent forces as the sovereign right of the Japanese nation, It also stated that the Japanese government would not use threats or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. It would eventually be known as the Peace Constitution. With guidance from General MacArthur's staff, the government also established basic reforms regarding education. The reforms stripped the administration of Japan's public school system away from the central government by establishing publicly elected boards of education. The selection of teachers, textbooks, and courses was now entirely up to the discretion of the people. It is interesting that in the 21st century, the U.S. government now wants to control children's education from the central federal government in Washington, D.C., and abolish this exact practice as wrong in Japan in the 1940s. There was some confusion between the Japanese and American officials about different draft versions, but as a conquered state, they were in no position to get the final say. The Americans handed the draft constitution to the Japanese government officials on February 13, 1946. The 7 years of governance under General MacArthur completely changed the socio-economic structure of Japan by transferring state sovereignty from central government autocrats to the hands of the Japanese people, triggering fundamental reforms. 10 years after General MacArthur's departure, Japan emerged as the world's second-largest economy, with national prosperity, tremendous wealth, and social stability. On the morning that General MacArthur was scheduled to leave Japan, Emperor Hirohito arrived at the U.S. Embassy to say goodbye. With tears in his eyes, MacArthur held the hands of his friend tightly. At the time, Japanese Prime Minister Yoshida said to General MacArthur, "General MacArthur, you have saved us from the fear of panic, uneasiness, and chaos by leading us down the path of post-war reconstruction and recovery. You have spread the seeds of democracy in every corner of our country." When the Korean War broke out in 1950, American soldiers occupying Japan were sent to the front lines. The constitutional rules that were set in stone suddenly became flexible. The American occupation force ordered Japan to organize the National Police Reserve that year, which was a Japanese army in all but name. It was given American military equipment. 2 years later, it became the National Safety Force and the Self-Defense Force in 1954, which presently has a very capable army and navy with modern equipment. When Vice President Richard Nixon visited Japan in 1953, he mentioned that Article 9 was a mistake, and that Japan should revise its constitution. This shows that idealism may be put into a document, but if the constitution of the country is not convenient, the national government will find loopholes to get around such strict rules. It's interesting that governments around the world are very flexible with rules that govern them, but extremely inflexible when it comes to rules for their own citizens. For example, can you imagine Americans suddenly reinterpreting the IRS tax code for their own benefit because it's inconvenient for them? Perhaps April 15th is a bad day for them. Also, the viewer should note that the United States government imposed rules on the Japanese people that they themselves could not follow then or now. Imagine if the United States were not able to use military force to solve international disputes, or the President of the United States coming out and declaring to the world that the United States forever renounces war as a sovereign right. Almost every day you hear on the news that the United States is interfering with other nations' internal affairs. General MacArthur certainly had his flaws, as evidenced in one of my other videos about his secret affair and divorce, but he knew how to fight a war and how to fight a peace with a former enemy. He had the foresight to realize that a former enemy like Japan could be a good ally in the future. He probably realized that former enemies who were treated incorrectly generally try to take their revenge at some point in the future. If you liked the video you just watched, then you may like these two other videos from EmersusTech.